Hello, it's April from April's Home, and last week I had the fun of going to both the pumpkin patch and the farmer's market. At the farmer's market, I knew it was apple season, so I was really excited to pick out a bunch of different varieties of apples to bake and cook with. I brought home this absolutely perfect little apple here with the leaf still attached. I thought that was so pretty. This variety here has red flesh. I'll cut one of those open and show you the inside of that in a minute, as well as just a bunch of random varieties here that I thought would be a nice mix to make some spiced apples, as well as an apple bar recipe that I plan to make today. At the pumpkin patch, I brought home a couple of fun bumpy pumpkins here, a littler one and a bigger one here, as well as this little teeny tiny pumpkin here that I thought would be nice to set out in my harvest decor. So I'm going to go ahead and get all of these apples washed up, as well as some of the Honeycrisp and Gala apples that I bought at Costco. And while I get all of these apples washed up and ready to go, I thought that I would play for you a short slideshow of my trip to the farmer's market, as well as our trip to the pumpkin patch. hope you enjoyed taking a look at our trip to the farmer's market as well as our trip to the pumpkin patch. We love going to the pumpkin patch every year, and also every year I look forward to going to the farmer's market during apple season, especially to find these red fleshed apples here. I believe these are called Mountain Rose apples. So this variety here, Mountain Rose, is just such a beautiful apple here. I just think that that's so pretty. I'm really excited to add this to some of my recipes today. So I've cleaned up all my apples, and I will also be cleaning up some of my Honeycrisp and Gala, like I said. I've also got out my apple peeler core slicer here so that it will make processing some of these apples a little bit easier today. And then also my trusty peel here. So I'm going to be making today a very small batch of apple butter and a batch of spiced apples for dinner tonight. Now I thought I would share with you how I make spiced apples, and also I'm going to kind of experiment with the apple butter here. Normally I make that in my crock pot, a nice big batch, but in recent years we haven't been going through it that quickly. So I thought that I would try a quicker stovetop version and cut down my recipe and just do it on the stove for a couple of hours and see how that turns out. We'll have that with biscuits later on in the week. So I'm going to go ahead now and get some of these apples through this peeler, core, and slicer for my apple butter, and slice up some of these and some of the others for my spiced apples. So I'm going to go ahead and get an apple set up on my apple peeler core slicer here so that I can show you how that works. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and try cutting this apple first. It really works best. These apple peeler cores and slicers really work best with a uniform sized apple so that your core can kind of aim through this little center here that will cut the core out. This kind of rides along the apple on the side of the apple, peeling it, and then this little thing here kind of slices the apple into a big spiral, and you'll see a bunch of the skin coming off in like a large peel there, which would be perfect for a compost bin, or if you have chickens. I used to have chickens and they would love eating that. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a spin here, see if I can do this with one hand holding the camera and one turning the apple. So you can see it starts to peel that off, and we'll keep going here. And then at the end, you can just pop the apple off. And then you've got this nice sliced up apple here. This apple was a little bit soft, so the core kind of broke out there, but typically the core is just on this little post here. You just kind of pull that off, and you're left with a big spiral cut pile of the apple peel. And there are interesting recipes for these apple peels as well. I know some people use them to make an apple tea. I don't use them for that, but it might be fun to try in the future. But I really do love these little apple peelers. They really do make processing your apples quite a bit quicker. So I'm going to go ahead and get the rest of these apples, the ones I'm putting in my apple butter, all sliced and peeled through this machine here. And then I'll show you my next step. Okay, so in my medium-sized saucepan here, I've cut up a bunch of different varieties of apples. I always like to include in baking recipes some sweet apples and some tart apples to help balance each other out. I've added about half a cup of water to this pan, and probably there were around, I'd say, 8 apples. Some were small, some were big. This is, again, a smaller recipe. You can, of course, double this recipe and make a large batch. And next, I'm going to go ahead and add half a cup of apple juice. Okay, so I'm just adding a nice unfiltered variety here. And then I'm going to add about a tablespoon of lemon juice here. So just a little bit of lemon juice. And then half a cup of sugar. So there's half a cup of sugar. And now I'm going to go ahead and add my spices. I'm going to add a teaspoon of cinnamon and then a few dashes of allspice. So there's the allspice. And then a dash of salt. So now I'm going to go ahead and stir this all together and turn the heat up to probably about medium and kind of get this to a simmer, and then I'll take a look at it from there. I'm going to probably cook this for around 2 hours until the apples are nice and soft, and then I will puree them using my immersion blender. So I'm going to go ahead and let these cook, and I'll come back and show you them when they're nice and steamed up. Okay, so my apple butter is doing well. It's getting nice and steamy, and one thing I forgot to mention is that you do need to stir this very frequently. So I'm going to stir this about every 10 to 15 minutes just to make sure it's not sticking to the bottom or getting overly hot or anything like that. And again, I'll just keep this going for a couple of hours until the apples are nice and soft. And next I'm going to make my spiced apples for dinner tonight, and I'm starting with half a stick of butter in a large nonstick skillet here. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on the heat and let this start melting. I've got my apples mostly all sliced up, so when this is all melted I will add my apples and spices and start sauteing that. Okay, so my butter is all melted and I'm going to add the first of my apples here. And I'm going to go ahead and get the rest added, and then I'll show you the spices. So I have all my apples in, and because it was such a large batch of apples, I decided to add a little bit more butter there. So I've added the other half a stick of butter, so there's a total of a whole stick of butter in here. And I'm going to go ahead and add a teaspoon of cinnamon. You don't need to add any other spices besides cinnamon, but just because I like allspice, I'm going to add a couple little dashes there of allspice. So I'm going to go ahead and let this simmer for a bit, and then I'll come back and add some sugar. Okay, so my spiced apples are coming along nicely. I did go ahead and add a few more dashes of cinnamon to this. It just looked like it needed a little bit more. I'm just continuing to kind of move these around as they kind of cook in the butter and steam through. I'm kind of waiting for these to be nice and soft, and then I'm going to add a cup of brown sugar. So I'm going to go ahead and let these cook a little bit longer, keep my eye on them so that they don't burn it all to the bottom. I've got my heat on medium so that they will go ahead and cook through nicely. And in a minute I'll come back and show you when I add the sugar and water. I decided to put a lid on this skillet for a little while to really let that steam cook the apples through. I want the apples to be cooked through, but not to the point of being like applesauce, so they still kind of hold their shape pretty well. Some of them are starting to break down, the smaller pieces, but some of the bigger pieces are still just a little bit too tough. So I'm going to go ahead and put this on for another couple minutes and let those apples kind of soften all the way through. Okay, so the apples are nice and soft, and now I'm going to go ahead and add a cup of water and a cup of brown sugar. So I'm going to go ahead and stir this all around and let that sugar dissolve in the hot liquid and kind of coat the apples. And then in a little bit, when that's all incorporated, I'm going to go ahead and add a slurry of water and cornstarch to kind of thicken up the sauce here and make a nice syrupy coating for all of these spiced apples. Okay, so now I'm going to make my thickener with a little bit of water. I've put about half a cup of water in there, and here's my cornstarch. And I'm just going to add a couple of rounded tablespoons here to the water, just like so. And then I'm going to stir this up until it's nice and dissolved in the water, and then I'll pour that in my nice bubbling hot mixture of apples and sugar and spice there. Okay, so I've turned the heat down to simmer. It's kind of bubbling a little bit more than I'd like. So now I'm going to go ahead and add my little cornstarch mixture here. I'm going to kind of swirl that together so that we get it nice and smooth, and just pour that in. And then I'm going to go ahead and stir that around until it thickens up my syrup here. And I'll come back and show you what that looks like. Okay, so I have the cornstarch all incorporated into the water and sugar mixture. You can see it's still a little bit liquidy here, and I would like to boil that down some. So I'm going to go ahead and let this simmer. I'm going to continuously kind of stir this around every minute or so to make sure that that sugar doesn't burn and it doesn't boil down too quickly or anything like that. But I'm going to go ahead and let that boil down some of this liquid, probably for another 10 minutes or so, but I'll let you know how long that takes, and I'll come back when it's all nice and thickened and cooked down a bit. Okay, so my spiced apples have cooked for a little bit longer, and the sauce has thickened up there a bit more. Ideally, I would have liked it to be a little thicker. I could have probably added a little bit more cornstarch or a little less water, but I think I'm going to go ahead and pull these off the heat now so that the apples don't overcook. I'm going to go ahead and transfer this to their serving dish, and I'll show you what that looks like. So here are my spiced apples all served up. I've put them in a nice little serving dish here, and they'll be all ready for dinner this evening. This makes such a nice side dish to so many dinners. I love serving this with sausages and pork meals, different pork meals, sort of like an applesauce. And I love serving this with turkey, roasted turkey. And tonight I'll be serving this alongside our cornbread chili bake. So I'm really excited for this delicious fall side dish here of spiced apples. So I hope you enjoyed seeing how to make this easy recipe here. It did take a little bit of time, but it is fairly simple and definitely a delicious fall taste. And now I'm going to go ahead and get back to work on my apple butter, and I'll give you an update on what that's looking like. Here's what the apple butter looks like. You can see it's cooking down nicely. I just keep stirring it every so often. It's kind of simmering away there. And you can see the apples really do start to break up quite a bit on their own as they cook down. And of course, when this is all done, I will be blending this up with an immersion blender. I've also in the past used a potato masher to kind of just crush this up a bit and make it nice and smooth so it is a nice apple butter. So that's what the apple butter looks like. It's probably got a good hour left to kind of simmer here on the stove, and I'll come back and share with you what that looks like before I go ahead and blend that up. Okay, so my apple butter has now reached a consistency that I think I'm happy with, and I'm just about ready to puree it with my immersion blender. It took quite a bit longer than I originally expected. Again, I think that this perhaps had a little more water than I thought, or I was cooking it on a low temperature to avoid it burning, so it did take close to like 3.5 hours to get it to this consistency, but I'm happy with that, and the house smells wonderful from cooking these apples all day long. So now I'm going to go ahead and get my immersion blender all set up, and I'm going to go ahead and blend this up and show you what that looks like. So this is my immersion blender here, and I'm just going to pulse this in here a little bit. I have let this cool down for 20 minutes, so that way there's no hot splashing liquid going on here. So I'm just going to do little pulses and kind of blend this together like so. Kind of just moving it around. So I'm going to go ahead and get that done and show you the consistency when I'm finished. So now you can see that this is nice and smooth here. All of the big chunks are broken up, and it's just a nice smooth consistency. I'm going to go ahead and get this transferred to a couple of containers and show you my finished product. Okay, so I've transferred my apple butter into this little crock here. This is about half of what I made. The other half I've put into a little Ziploc container, and I will store these both in the fridge. So this one is already in a nice serving container here and will be perfect to serve alongside biscuits later this week. And this one I can open up in a week or so to serve with another dinner. So this lasts for a couple of weeks in the fridge. You can also put this in a freezer safe container and freeze it, but we usually just used it up in a couple of weeks. So that was my day of cooking with apples. I will also be sharing in a future video my apple bars that I will also be making with my apples. I hope you enjoyed taking a look at all of my apples, our trip to the farmer's market and the pumpkin patch, as well as my recipe for spiced apples and apple butter. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit subscribe for more videos from April's Home. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you later. Goodbye.